This is my presentation for the past 3 labs. The first lab that we went to was Blue Springs. The first species I identified was the manatee, Trichechus monotus laterostris. A fun fact would be that they're closely related to elephants. I identified this species based off of its large gray body. It's a aquatic mammal, and the guide told us it was a manatee. The next species is the Pseudemus species. Now, there seems to be some contention as to species versus subspecies in Florida, but it is a cooter. A fun fact would be that it comes from the word kuta, from the Bambara and Malinke languages in Africa. I identified this turtle based off of other turtles that I saw basking in the sun. Usually they have a yellow, reddish, orangish coloration on their back, as well as a very distinct pattern on their shell. The next species was a lumpkin, which is a brown bird with white streaks and a slightly curved bill. A fun fact would be that the lumpkin is the only member of its taxonomic family, Arimidae. The scientific name is Aramis guarana. The next species up is radio, Lepomis microrelphus. This species was difficult to identify, but I came to this conclusion based off of a few different things. It was solitary, which this species in its juvenile stage does live in schools, but in their adult years it's mostly solitary. Also, I cross-referenced it with the billboard that they had at the park of common species, and the overall body structure resembled it. The next species up was the long-nosed gar, Lepistosteus osseus. A fun fact would be that Carl Linnaeus gave this fish the original name Esox osseus, with Esox standing for pike. The name was later changed to its current one. I identified this species based off of the very obvious factor here, which is that the long, thin snout. The next species was the bluegill, Lepomis macrochirus. I identified this species based off of the fact that it's living in a school of fish of 10 to 20, as well as the overall body structure, again cross-referencing it with that chart that was at the park. My videos were not very high quality, so that's the best I could do. The next ecosystem we went to was Econlockhatchee. And look, I spotted a bear. Okay, no I didn't. The next species I identified was the great blue heron, Ardea herodias, or the great egret, Ardea alba. They're pretty closely related. Both of their tracks look similar. I identified this track based off of those 3 distinct toes, the overall size of like 5 to 6 inches, as well as the sort of offset toe in the back. A fun fact would be that in South Florida, where a white population of great blue herons exists, there's a hybridization zone between this white population as well as the normal population called Werdemann's herons, and they're very beautiful. You should look at them. The next species was double-striped bluet, which is a damselfly. Like all other damselflies, or most damselflies, they perch with their wings up. I identified it based off of its mostly black abdomen with blue rings at its joints. The next species I identified was a wild boar, or Suscrofa. A fun fact would be that these swine aren't native. They were introduced in the 1500s to Florida. I identified this species based off of its tracks. You could really only confuse it with white-tailed deer, but their toes are a bit more pointed outwards. The next species was alligator weed, Alternanthera phylloxeroides. A fun fact would be that the alligator weed flea beetle, a type of beetle that feeds on this plant, was introduced as the first biocontrol in the US in an attempt to control this invasive plant's spread. I identified the species based off of the mat-like formation it was growing in over the water, as well as that segmented kind of body that you can see with the leaves sticking out at various points across the stem. The next species up was the sawgrass, or Cladium jamaicense. Now, I'm not too certain about this, but sawgrass is found all throughout Florida. It's a very tall growing grass, so I identified it as such. A fun fact would be that Sawgrass Mills is the largest outlet mall in the US, and it's aptly named after sawgrass. The next species is Carolina ponyfoot, Dichondra carolinensis. A fun fact is that it serves as a great alternative for your lawn. It grows low to the ground and it has these kidney-shaped leaves. The next species up is the yellow wood sorrel, or Oxalis florida. It has these distinct 3 type of heart-shaped clovers, and a fun fact is that it can be eaten in salads for its tangy taste, but don't eat too much because it has high levels of oxalates. The next species up is a climbing hemp vine, or Macania scandens. A fun fact would be that the Seminoles used this plant to treat skin conditions resulting in itching. You can see it right here, and I identified it based off of these small flowers that it produces, and the fact that it was growing in a vine-like pattern over the other flora. The next species was this mushroom. I identified it down to Tuberaceae. And a fun fact is that this mushroom is named Twiglet, the mushroom that I believe this is named Twiglet because it grows in and around twigs. It's got this brown coloration with a textured pattern, fuzzy-like pattern on its top, its dome. The next ecosystem we went to was New Smyrna Beach. The first species I identified here was pinfish, Lagodon rhomboides. I identified it based off of its silver, yellow, blue coloration, as well as that darker spot above its first fin. And a fun fact is that pinfish make a croaking sound during mating season. The next species was a tidal spray crab, Plagusia depressa. It has a reddish, brownish coloration. They're also found in near the shore. This one got washed up. It was dead. And it's also, they like rocky environments, and there was rocks not too far from us there. A fun fact is that before mating, they do a courtship ritual using olfactory and tactile cues. The next species is the Florida stone crab. I identified it based off of this very distinct crab extremity right here, the pincher, which Florida legislation actually bars you from harvesting crabs based off of this pincher. If it's too small, you can't get it. So this crab, Menape mercenaria, a fun fact would be that 98% of stone crabs are harvested in Florida for the entirety of the U.S. Or that the 98% of the stone crabs that are harvested are for the entirety of the U.S. From Florida. Now, the next species was moon jellyfish, Aurelia arida. A fun fact would be that their bodies are composed of 95% water, hence why they have this clear coloration. And then they also do have a pattern of stripes. You just can't see it because they're covered in sand. The next species up is the cannonball jellyfish, Stomalophus meleagris. A fun fact is that when they're disturbed, they secrete a toxic mucus, and they get their name from the cannonball shape that they have right here. I identified it based off its coloration, that kind of brownish ring of coloration on its dome. The next species up was the southern puffer. Now I identified this based off of its overall body shape. Pufferfish are pretty unique in that sense, but also the brown pattern with the gray spots, as well as its beak. So Sphoradus nephilus. A fun fact of this species would be that in Japan folklore, fugu, which means pufferfish, is highly respected. There's a tale of a samurai who ate and barely lived to tell the tale, and then he said that he declared that anyone else that tried to eat this was either extremely brave or an immense fool. The next species up was the giant Atlantic cockle, Dinocardium robustum. Now, normally they would have a kind of pinkish, brownish, peach color, but this one's been sun bleached. Now, when alive, they bury themselves in the sand with their singular foot, and I identified this based off of its ribbed shell shape. The next species up is the lightning whelk, which is Sinistro fulgur perversum. Now, a fun fact would be that Native Americans used these shells as tools for centuries before colonialism, and identified this shell based off of its round shape, kind of that kind of concave curved shape as well. I think it looks kind of like a crown, and it's got a sinistral shell opening, which is kind of to the left. The next piece up was the firewheel, also known as Indian carpet, Gaillardia pulchella. It's called that because of its coloration of purple, red, and yellow, which resembles a carpet from India. In rich soils, a fun fact would be that it actually produces large and floppy plants, which I wouldn't expect, considering it's growing in rich soils. So you'd expect kind of the opposite. The next species is the sea oat, Uniola paniculata. A fun fact would be that they reproduce via underground stems called rhizomes, and they grow these kind of oat-looking seeds. The next species is the seaside goldenrod, Solidago sempervirens. Now, this species does have yellow leaves. They're not in this photo, but they grow at the stem, and then they have, yellow flowers, but then their leaves grow directly attached to the stem, which you can see here. A fun fact would be that they can grow up to 7 feet tall, and they fall over when they do reach that height. Marsh pennywort is the next species, Hydrocaudal umbellata. I identified it based off of this singular leaf that it produces, with a bumpy kind of edge to it. A fun fact is that this plant is a member of the carrot family. The next species up was the spotted bee balm, which, if you could guess where it gets its name from, it's because it attracts a lot of bees and other pollinators. In fact, there's one in this photo. If you can see it, it's a green bee. Now, right here, you can see these kind of pinkish leaves that are mistaken for petals. Their actual leaves are further in, and they have spots, and they're a lot smaller. The next species was sea grape, Coccoloba uvifera, growing right out of the ground. This one's a juvenile. I identified it based off of its oblong, kind of large leaves that have a leathery texture. They also grow in sandy environments, and they produce red, edible, grape-like fruits, hence their name. The next species up is camphorweed, Heterotheca subaxillaris. I identified it based off of these yellow flowers, the fact that it's growing low to the ground, and it's in the sandy environment. And a fun fact would be that it gets its name from the camphor-like scent, which is a medicinal scent that it produces when it's crushed. Thanks for watching.